Yes, we're still talking about developments with regards the NNPC restructuring, and so I'm talking with Rolake Akikunbe, who is the head energy and natural resources at FBN Quest. So good morning to you, and thank you so much for coming on the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, have you seen the new structure of this this new restructuring? What does it tell you?
Well, essentially, what has been happened in this restructuring, that is, the NNPC has created 4 units focusing on the upstream, covering NPDC and another entity, the downstream, and the refineries, as well as the gas and power company. And there are 4 other entities which fall within the group HQ. Now, of course, you're seeing a lot of speculation in the media and a lot of talk around what does this actually mean, and is this within the legal and constitutional framework of what the NNPC can do. My take on that, my interpretation of what has happened is it's not an unbundling in the sense of what we saw with PHCN years ago, where PHCN was privatized and eventually the old legacy company was liquidated. In this case, those structures will still report to the group GMD, even though they will have individual CEOs. And actually, when you look at the NNPC Act in Section 6, it does give the corporation leeway to create subsidiaries as it deems fit to carry out the functions.
But then these are not subsidiaries. These are autonomous units, according to the NNPC. So it's making the NNPC comprises of a lean group HQ and 4 autonomous business units, and then we have 7 strategic units. So all in all, we have got 11. That's against the 12 strategic units. Now, if you go to the NNPC's website, you have the breakdown of what the subsidiaries are supposed to be. But this restructuring does not follow that.
Well, I think there's one way to look at it. If you define a subsidiary as a company that is part of a whole and reports to a holding company, essentially this is what the structure is. But we have to be very careful, because essentially what is not happening here is a divestment of NNPC shares. 100% holding in NNPC still resides within the government in the NNPC overarching entity. It is very possible that further down the line there could be a real unbundling of NNPC, which this actual restructuring positions NNPC to do. Essentially, the lean aspect here is to improve efficiency, create smaller units that are more focused, more targets, will eventually have their own profit and loss, their own balance sheets that allow them maybe in the near term to retain their revenues and reinvest their revenues. The other thing I would point out is the efficiency drive. If you look in the operating deficits of NNPC, compare August 2015 to January, operating deficits of the entity has actually reduced. So the imperative behind this reform is actually a really sound one, because it's also going to help plug the leakages. I think, unfortunately, over the last couple of days, there's been some level of misinterpretation, miscommunication, because in Nigerian speak, when you mention unbundling, people automatically think job losses, you're curtailing staff, you're laying off people, you're going to privatize and sell shares.
But then the group and the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources came out and clarified that it wasn't an unbundling. It's actually a restructuring, a reorganization.
A reorganization, because NNPC has had business units. What you're looking at is looking at the whole institutional ecosystem of NNPC and figure out where is best to locate certain companies and assets. Let me give you 2 examples. If you take the example of NGC, NGC till now has been managing gas transportation and gas marketing. Under this new structure, the gas and power will focus separately on the wholesale side and focus separately on the marketing side. That will introduce a certain level of detail and efficiency into the system. Same with PPMC. So we might actually, it's possible that we might see the creation of new entities as well. Because with PPMC, for example, which has been focused on the pipeline business and the marketing business, you now have those 2 separated. And so when you look at the entire value chain of the industry, there's a new focus on competence, there's a new focus on governance, and the idea really here is how do you position NNPC as a whole as a world-class, commercially focused institution with profit-making at its heart, with efficiency at its heart. And I think perhaps there's a degree of enlightened self-interest that needs to sit, because in the long run, we probably will all be better off.
Okay, then a lot of people are now saying that this should have benefits in the long run. You seem to have, listed most of those, but in particular for Nigeria and in particular the oil and gas sector, especially with the recent challenges that we're having. We keep having recurrent fuel scarcity. We've got refineries that are not functioning, and in some cases totally closed down. So at what point are we going to see, are Nigerians going to see the benefits of this reorganizing or restructuring, as the case may be, when the National Assembly decides to allow the NNPC carry on?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's also an issue of the National Assembly taking a position on what the restructuring means from a legal and constitutional limit. We should also not bear in mind that there's parallel legislation in the works. So the PIB is still in the works, and the PIB actually proposes more radical reforms. I think there's a degree of patience that's required, but there's also been some improvements over the last 12 months. And, you know, ultimately what we're talking about is to plug leakages and introduce a proper governance and institutional framework. One of the immediate things that I think certainly needs to happen, we're currently reliant on petroleum products. 70%, over 70% of our consumption is imported. That is not sustainable in the long term. The refineries obviously need to rehabilitate, and Kachiko has said he would do that. There's also now talk of co-locating new refineries in the refinery hubs that we currently have. I think that's a positive step, but implementation will be key. And it's also good to see that each of these entities now have CEOs appointed who can focus on these aspects. But essentially what needs to happen is a creation of an enabling environment that may attract potentially local investors. On the petroleum products import side, we also need to revisit that whole infrastructure. If we're producing and refining the bulk of our requirement locally, then all these issues we've had historically around subsidies, reflecting transportation costs and costs to retailers would not be an issue. And, you know, coming here this morning, you know, I was coming to talk about NNPC, I was stuck in traffic for 2 hours because along the stretch of the road from the old toll right through to Isheri, several petrol stations. So it's an issue that affects the lives of everyday Nigerians. And essentially, I think we're all stakeholders. We all have a voice, but clearly there's a reform drive and momentum that has begun, and we have to have some level of confidence that we'll start to see the fruits of the most recent change.
Quickly comment on this. You talked about, of course, we have 3 refineries, well, 4 refineries technically, and then there's more talk of having modular refineries come on stream. How do you think this is going to well, how are they going to co-opt it so it becomes a win-win situation for all?
Well, part of the rationale behind co-locating these refineries, and I'm sure the government will have been speaking to experts and consultants, is to look at shared use of services and infrastructure. So if you look at some of our key refining hubs, say around Port Harcourt, with the Port Harcourt refinery, the petrochemicals plants, there's certain supporting infrastructure around depots and storage network. So the idea is, rather than have potential greenfield investors come and rebuild some of these other supporting infrastructure from scratch, you can find a way to share infrastructure. The other thing is that modular refineries are not actually new, specifically the type of modular refineries we know as topping plants, and they've mostly focused on diesel production because diesel is a fully deregulated market. So it's not a new technology in Nigeria. It's relatively easy to build, and most are usually maybe a 10,000 barrel a day modular refinery will be about $40 million, which when you look at the refining business is not a huge capital investment. So there's a lot to learn from in terms of what private sector investors are already doing in Nigeria. So I think it might be a good way forward, but I think the strategy clearly needs to be well thought out because there's certain inefficiencies in today's refineries which need to be addressed, and the government is looking to rehabilitate and upgrade those going forward.
But then do you think that this restructuring will affect IOC joint ventures?
Certainly. I mean, obviously, NAPIMS as an entity has been one managing the government's share in these JVs. But part of this restructuring is eventually will allow some of these entities potentially to become limited liability companies. That we don't have clarity on yet, and maybe incorporated further down the line. We know there's a lot of discussion, but ultimately is revenue retention and investing the money you make. And of course, the cash call obligations have proved to be an unsustainable way for NNPC to finance itself. And there's a clear recognition of the need to find alternative ways of financing and open up NNC to a broader suite of investors. So it is very possible that under the future JV structure and even some of the considerations under the PIB, which look to separate the JVs from the PSs, that NNPC will be in a better position and its subsidiaries to raise finance through channels that it deems relevant to its commercial and operational goals. And I think that will be a major positive for the firm.
You know, another thing I think I've picked up on since we started this conversation was the fact that there's no clarity. So details are still sketchy with regards what these entities or these units, as the case may be, are expected to do. What are they expected to bring to the table different from what we already know? So will this new NNPC be a game changer?
Certainly, I think it's fair to say, at least in my living memory of sort of following the industry and looking at the industry, over and beyond revisions to the existing NNPC Act, this is probably one of the most radical steps of reform. You know, when you look at the base we're coming from, possibly not radical in the sense of what the PIB is proposing, and we know that's a legislative process, but certainly in terms of there's some thinking about NNPC becoming a commercial-like entity, maybe mirroring some of the work of its peers around the world. If you look at some of the other emerging market national oil companies, the likes of Petronas, Petrobras, and even some in the OECD world, such as Statoil, I think there's a sense in which the government recognizes that NNPC is on a journey, and in order to get to its destination, there's certain hard decisions that need to be made, but it also recognizes the need to carry on all the other stakeholders, over and beyond the unions. All of us Nigerians are stakeholders because it is relevant to our everyday lives. So
we're waiting for the NNPC to bring out more clarity with regards to this restructuring, and of course after its meeting with the National Assembly, we might probably get a more clearer picture of actually what's going on. But Rolake, thank you so much for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.